You hear me, diver? Stay away from my dock unless someone important calls you. The marina owner's voice cracked across the polished decks while investors watched the soaked maintenance diver climbing from the water. Workers like you belong under the docks, not near my guests. Laughter rippled across the private marina, expensive shoes edging back from the puddles around the quiet man's boots. He didn't argue. He just lifted a coil of rope and looked toward the restless bay. Minutes later, a group of arriving Marines slowed mid-step, eyes narrowing the moment they recognized him. Sometimes the quietest man in work boots carries the loudest history. Before anyone understood why those Marines suddenly went silent, the dock beneath the yachts began to groan. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. Most people on that shining marina believed power lived in tailored suits and glass offices. They hadn't noticed the man who kept the entire place from falling into the sea. Daniel Mercer pulled himself fully onto the dock, water streaming from the sleeves of his faded work jacket. He moved slowly, not with shame, but with the steady calm of someone used to storms. Victor Langford stood above him beside a polished yacht railing, irritation sharpening his smile. "Next time you climb onto my dock uninvited," he said, "remember who owns this place." Daniel simply nodded once. Behind the rope barrier, Harper Mercer clutched the strap of her small backpack. She had finished homework on a folding chair while waiting for her father's shift to end. The girl knew the routine of long hours and quiet patience. Her father gave her a quick, reassuring smile before turning back toward the equipment crate. The marina shimmered with wealth. Glass towers overlooked rows of yachts, while music drifted from a corporate reception. Servers carried silver trays between investors discussing property deals worth millions. Down near the waterline, the diver checked a thick steel cable running beneath the dock. His fingers paused against a vibration most people would never notice. Metal hummed faintly through the structure. A warning sign whispered through the bones of the dock. Daniel frowned slightly. Above him, Langford's laughter rose again as another investor complimented the marina expansion. "Best private harbor on the coast," someone declared proudly. The diver glanced once more at the trembling cable. Water slapped softly against the pylons. He tightened the wrench and continued working. Up on the dock, Harper watched everything with wide, patient eyes. She had heard rich men talk down to her father before. But she had also seen strangers shake his hand with quiet respect. A rumble rolled faintly through the dock again. This time, the diver looked up sharply. Something beneath the marina had begun to shift. The crowd above kept laughing. Only one man seemed to hear the warning hidden under the water. He set down his wrench slowly. Far across the marina entrance, a black SUV stopped near the reception banners. Several Marines stepped out in dress uniforms. One of them paused. His gaze locked onto the maintenance diver kneeling beside the dock cables. Recognition slowly replaced confusion on the Marine's face. "Sergeant," he murmured under his breath. The diver hadn't noticed them yet. He was listening to the water. Another vibration rippled through the dock. Stronger this time. Above, Langford lifted a champagne glass to toast his investors. "Gentlemen," he announced proudly, "this harbor is built to last forever." Beneath the dock, the diver's eyes narrowed. Steel cables trembled in the water like strained violin strings. He rose slowly. Somewhere deep under the marina, something had started to fail. He turned toward the dock ladder. And for the first time since Langford shouted at him, urgency entered his voice. "Everyone should step back from the edge," he called calmly. Nobody listened. Not yet. But within minutes the entire marina would wish they had. The Marines were already moving. The one who recognized him walked faster, eyes fixed on the diver. He stopped beside Harper. "Is that your dad working down there?" he asked gently. The girl nodded proudly. The Marine looked back toward the dock cables with growing concern, because if that quiet diver really was who he thought it was, the warning he just gave should not be ignored. He turned toward the reception crowd. "Sir," the Marine called toward Langford, voice suddenly firm. "You might want to listen to that diver." Langford scoffed loudly. But beneath the dock the cables groaned again, and the water around the pylons began to churn. The diver looked up once more. This time he didn't wait for permission. He grabbed his diving mask and moved toward the ladder. Because whatever was happening beneath that marina had just begun. They would soon learn. The diver was already halfway down the ladder when the first sharp crack echoed through the marina. Several investors stopped mid-conversation. A glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered across the polished dock boards. Daniel dropped the last few feet into the water without hesitation. Cold waves closed around him while the marina lights shimmered above like broken gold. From the surface, the dock still looked perfect. Below it, the truth was very different. Steel support cables stretched tight between the pylons, vibrating under immense pressure. One of the underwater brackets had shifted nearly 3 inches, twisting the entire structure. He exhaled slowly through his regulator. Something beneath the marina foundation was giving way. If the cables snapped, the dock would collapse like a row of dominoes. Above the waterline, Victor Langford waved dismissively at the Marine who had spoken up. "Relax," Langford said loudly. "It's a floating dock. They creak all the time." The Marine's jaw tightened. Harper stood near the rope barrier, watching the water where her father had disappeared. She trusted him. Still, the long silence made her stomach twist. Back under the dock, the diver ran a gloved hand along the vibrating cable. His mind mapped the entire marina layout automatically. Weight distribution. Anchor points. Stress lines. This wasn't random damage. The new expansion wing had shifted the balance of the entire structure. Too much weight on one section. One failure would cascade into dozens. Daniel kicked toward the central pylon, checking the weld joints. The metal plate had cracked clean across. A slow breath left him. That explained the vibration. Above him, the celebration continued. Music played. Champagne glasses clinked. Langford laughed with his investors. "Trust me," he said confidently, "this marina is engineered better than any harbor in the country." The Marine who had recognized Daniel wasn't listening anymore. Staff Sergeant Marco Ruiz had served 8 years in the Marines. He knew the look of someone calculating danger, and he knew exactly where he had seen that diver before. Ruiz stepped closer to the water's edge. Another faint shudder moved through the dock. This time several people felt it. "What was that?" someone asked. Langford rolled his eyes, the tide shifting. Beneath the water, Daniel saw the second cable begin to fray. Thin strands of steel snapped with quiet metallic pops. His heartbeat slowed. Not panic. Focus. If that cable failed, the yacht pier would drop several feet instantly. Anyone standing near the edge would fall straight into the collapsing framework. He surfaced beside the ladder and pulled off his regulator. "Everyone needs to move away from the dock," he called calmly. Langford turned with obvious annoyance. "Excuse me?" "This section is under stress," Daniel continued. "Too much load on the pylons." One of the investors chuckled. "You're getting engineering advice from the maintenance diver now?" Laughter rippled again. Langford stepped closer to the edge. "You're here to clean barnacles off my docks," he said sharply. "Not lecture my guests." The diver looked at him evenly. "I'm telling you what's about to happen." Langford smirked. "What's about to happen is you finishing your shift quietly." Ruiz stepped forward. "Sir, maybe we should," Langford cut him off. "And who are you?" "Staff Sergeant Marco Ruiz," Langford waved dismissively. "Good for you." The Marine glanced back at Daniel. Recognition flickered stronger now. He leaned closer to the water. "Mercer," Ruiz said carefully. The diver paused. Ruiz's voice dropped. "Captain Mercer?" For a moment the sounds of the marina faded. Daniel looked up slowly. Their eyes met. Recognition passed between them like a silent signal. Ruiz straightened instantly. The respect in his posture was impossible to miss. Behind him, several other Marines had begun walking toward the dock. Langford noticed the sudden shift. "What's going on?" he demanded. Ruiz didn't answer. He was watching the water again. Because the dock had just moved. Not creaked. Moved. A low grinding noise rose from beneath the planks. Harper stepped back instinctively. Daniel grabbed the ladder rail. "Everyone off the dock," he said again. His voice hadn't gotten louder. But it had changed. Authority settled into the words, the kind that made trained soldiers react before thinking. Ruiz turned sharply toward the crowd. "You heard him," the Marine barked. "Step back from the edge." Some people hesitated. Others laughed nervously. Langford scoffed. "This is ridiculous." The diver looked at him once more. "If that cable snaps," he said quietly, "your entire dock drops 6 feet." Langford folded his arms. "You expect me to believe that?" A metallic twang echoed beneath the dock. Sharp, violent. The water churned suddenly around the pylons. Daniel's eyes locked onto the central support beam. The fraying cable had just lost another strand. Ruiz's voice cut across the marina. "Move away from the dock." Panic finally rippled through the crowd. People stepped back. Servers abandoned trays. Investors stumbled toward the reception platform. Langford hesitated only a second. Then the entire dock lurched. A deafening snap exploded beneath the water. One of the main support cables had finally broken. The pier dropped several inches instantly. Screams erupted across the marina. And Daniel Mercer was already diving back under the collapsing structure. By the way, if you're enjoying this story so far, hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next, because what's coming will change everything for everyone standing on this dock. The moment the cable snapped, the dock shuddered like a living thing trying to tear itself free from the sea. People stumbled backward. Champagne glasses rolled across the planks. One of the smaller yachts slammed against the pier with a violent crunch that silenced the entire marina. Daniel disappeared beneath the surface just as the water erupted around the pylons. Below the dock, chaos had already begun. The broken cable whipped through the water like a metal serpent, twisting around one of the central support beams. The pressure from the drifting yachts had started pulling the entire structure sideways. Daniel kicked hard through the murky water, reaching the damaged pylon. The metal bracket had split further. If the second cable failed, the entire section of dock would collapse inward. Above the waterline, panic was spreading. Investors rushed toward the exit ramp. Servers abandoned trays of food. Music from the reception speakers cut off abruptly. Victor Langford stood frozen for a moment, staring at the shifting planks beneath his feet. "This is impossible," he muttered. Staff Sergeant Marco Ruiz wasn't watching Langford. His eyes were locked on the water. Because the man beneath the dock wasn't reacting like a maintenance worker. He was moving like someone trained to solve disasters under pressure. Ruiz had seen that exact calm before. Years earlier, in a combat zone halfway across the world. Another loud crack ripped through the marina. A section of dock dropped another inch, everyone off. Ruiz shouted again. The remaining guests scrambled toward safety. Harper clutched the rope barrier, searching the water for her father. The surface churned violently as air bubbles burst upward. Then Daniel emerged beside the ladder again. His face was tight with concentration. "Clear the dock completely," he said. It's not stable. Langford had finally regained his voice. You're overreacting. The diver shook his head once. The main anchor bracket has failed, Langford scoffed. You don't even know what you're talking about. Ruiz stepped forward slowly. That man knows exactly what he's talking about. Langford glared at him. And you know this how? Ruiz didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down at the diver again. Sir, Ruiz called carefully. Do you want us clearing the marina? Daniel paused for the briefest moment. The word sir hung in the air. Langford noticed immediately. Did you just call him sir? Ruiz ignored him. The diver finally nodded. Get everyone to the main platform, Daniel said, and keep the boats from drifting closer. Ruiz turned instantly. You heard him. He shouted to the other Marines approaching the dock. 2 Marines ran toward the mooring lines. Another began directing people away from the unstable pier. Langford stared at them in disbelief. You're taking orders from a diver now? Ruiz turned back slowly. His expression had hardened. No, he said calmly. I'm taking advice from someone who saved my entire unit once. Langford blinked. What? But Ruiz wasn't explaining further, because beneath the dock another grinding sound echoed through the pylons. The diver had already gone under again. Below the surface, Daniel reached the damaged bracket and inspected the broken weld. The crack had widened. Water pressure and boat movement were forcing the support beam sideways. He needed to stabilize it immediately. His mind calculated distances and weight loads automatically. Years of training resurfaced without effort. He swam toward the twisted cable and grabbed it firmly. The steel line trembled violently in his hands. Above the water, Harper watched anxiously. Ruiz stepped beside her. Your dad's got this, he said gently. The girl nodded. I know. Ruiz looked down at her. You know, she shrugged. He fixes everything. The Marine smiled faintly. That sounded exactly like the man he remembered. Back on the dock, Langford was growing increasingly irritated. This entire situation is ridiculous, he snapped. We have engineers for this marina. Ruiz didn't even glance at him. They're not here. Langford gestured angrily toward the water. And he is? Ruiz folded his arms. You're lucky he is. Langford scoffed again. You act like he's some kind of hero. Ruiz looked at him directly now. He is. Langford opened his mouth to respond. Then the dock dropped again. Hard, a loud scream erupted from the far end of the pier. One of the teenagers from the investor families had been leaning over the railing. The sudden shift sent him sliding straight across the wet planks. His foot slipped between 2 broken boards. Before anyone could react, the wood splintered beneath him. The teenager plunged straight through the collapsing section of dock. Water exploded upward as he vanished below the surface. Ethan! Langford screamed. For the first time that night, pure panic shattered the arrogance in his voice. Ruiz moved instantly. But he stopped at the edge of the broken boards. The entire structure was still collapsing. Anyone who jumped from there could be crushed. Harper gasped. The water churned violently around the pylons. Then suddenly, a dark shape shot upward beneath the surface. Daniel Mercer surged through the water like a torpedo. His hand grabbed the sinking boy's jacket before the broken beams could trap him below. Above the dock, Ruiz exhaled sharply. Yeah, he murmured quietly. That's exactly the man I remember. The boy's head broke the surface with a choking gasp as the diver hauled him upward. Water exploded around them while broken boards drifted across the churning marina. Daniel locked one arm around Ethan Langford's chest and kicked hard toward the ladder. Above them, Victor Langford dropped to his knees at the edge of the damaged pier. Ethan, he shouted, voice cracking. Hold on. The dock groaned again. Another plank snapped loose and slid into the water. Ruiz moved fast, grabbing a life ring from the emergency post and tossing it toward them. "Catch!" The diver ignored it. His focus was on keeping the boy's head above the water while the unstable dock shifted overhead. Ethan coughed violently. I can't feel my leg," the teenager wheezed. Daniel glanced down quickly. The boy's foot was still tangled in a twisted length of metal cable beneath the surface. If the structure shifted again, the cable could drag him under. The diver took a slow breath. "Listen to me," he said calmly. "Stay still. I've got you." Above them, Langford was pacing wildly. "Why isn't anyone pulling them out?" he yelled. Ruiz grabbed the marina ladder and leaned down. "They're pinned," the Marine shouted back. "If we pull wrong, we'll tear the kid's leg apart." Langford froze. For the first time that night, the wealthy developer looked completely helpless. His eyes darted across the marina. Investors stood back in stunned silence. Security guards hovered uselessly near the entrance. None of his power meant anything right now. Below the dock, Daniel took another breath and dove under. Cold water swallowed him instantly. The cable wrapped around Ethan's ankle had tightened when the dock shifted. One wrong move could pull the entire beam loose. He studied the structure carefully. The broken support bracket had jammed against the pylon, trapping the cable in place. Daniel reached for the tool clipped to his belt. A compact marine cutter. He tested the tension first. The cable vibrated violently in his grip. Above the surface, Ruiz watched the water with narrowed eyes. "He's cutting it," the Marine said quietly. Langford looked at him desperately. "Then why isn't he coming up?" Ruiz didn't answer. "Because the diver hadn't cut yet." Daniel surfaced again beside Ethan. "Your foot's trapped in a tension cable," he said calmly. The teenager's face had gone pale. "Am I going to lose my leg?" "No." The answer came instantly. Steady. Certain. "But you have to trust me." Ethan nodded weakly. Above them, Langford leaned closer. "What's happening?" Daniel looked up briefly. "I need everyone away from the dock edge," he said. Langford blinked. "Why?" Ruiz answered before the diver could. "Because when he cuts that cable, the dock's going to shift again." The realization spread across Langford's face. "You're saying the whole thing could collapse?" Ruiz's voice stayed calm. "I'm saying if people stay standing there, someone else is going in the water." Langford stood frozen for a moment. Then he turned toward the remaining crowd. "Everyone back," he shouted. People hurried farther away. The dock creaked again, responding to the shifting weight. Below the surface, Daniel dove once more. The cutter slipped from its sheath. He positioned the blade carefully against the steel strands. The cable was under enormous tension. Cutting it would release that pressure instantly. The structure might stabilize, or it might tear the entire beam loose. Above the water, Ethan clung weakly to the floating debris. "Is he still down there?" the boy whispered. Ruiz nodded. "He's working." Langford stared at the dark water. "You sound awfully confident." The Marine's eyes never left the surface. "I've watched him do worse in a combat zone." Langford blinked. "You're serious?" Ruiz glanced at him briefly. "Sir, the last time I saw that man working underwater, he was defusing explosives while our entire unit was pinned down." Langford stared at the water in stunned silence. A burst of bubbles suddenly erupted beside Ethan. Daniel surfaced again. "Everyone clear?" he asked. Ruiz nodded. "Dock's empty." The diver placed a steady hand on Ethan's shoulder. "When you feel the cable release," he said quietly, "kick straight up." The teenager swallowed hard. "Okay." Daniel took one more breath and dove. The cutter bit into the steel cable. Strand by strand began snapping. The tension in the line screamed through the water. Above the surface, Ruiz took a step back. "Here it comes," he murmured. Langford gripped the railing. The final strand gave way. The cable snapped loose with explosive force. The entire dock lurched sideways. Water surged violently around the pylons, but the twisted beam finally shifted away from Ethan's trapped leg. Daniel shot upward instantly, grabbing the boy and pushing him toward the ladder. Ruiz leaned down and grabbed Ethan's arm. Got him. With one powerful pull, the Marine hauled the teenager onto the dock. Langford rushed forward and grabbed his son. "Ethan, are you hurt?" The boy coughed water but managed a weak shake of his head. Behind them, Daniel pulled himself out of the water again. The marina had gone completely silent. Investors stared at him. Security guards stared at him. Even Langford slowly turned. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Ruiz stepped forward. His posture straightened instinctively, and in front of everyone watching, the Marine saluted the soaked maintenance diver. The salute froze the entire marina. Dozens of investors stood silent on the reception platform, their expensive shoes still damp from the water that had splashed across the dock. Victor Langford looked from the Marine's raised hand to the soaked maintenance diver standing beside the ladder. For a moment he said nothing. The man he had mocked minutes earlier now stood at the center of a crowd that suddenly wasn't laughing anymore. Daniel Mercer lowered his gaze slightly when he saw the salute. "Marco, don't," he said quietly. Staff Sergeant Ruiz didn't move. "With respect, sir, I have to." The word "sir" echoed through the marina like a dropped anchor. Langford blinked. "You keep calling him that," he said sharply. "Why?" Ruiz lowered his hand slowly, but his posture remained straight. "Because that's Captain Mercer." A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. Investors glanced at one another. The soaked diver looked anything but a captain. Daniel sighed softly. "That was a long time ago," he said. Ruiz shook his head. "Not to the people you brought home alive." The dock creaked again, though the worst of the tension had eased after the cable snapped. Daniel glanced toward the pylons automatically. His mind was still calculating, still measuring. The structure wasn't safe yet. But Langford barely noticed the dock anymore. His attention had locked entirely onto the diver. "You're telling me," Langford said slowly, "this man used to be an officer?" Ruiz gave a short nod. "Combat engineer. Marine Corps." Several of the other Marines had now reached the dock as well. Each one stopped a few steps away from Daniel. Respect showed in the way they stood, not stiff like a ceremony, steady. The kind of respect soldiers give someone who once led them through danger. Langford stared at the diver's worn jacket, at the scuffed boots, at the modest tool belt hanging at his side. "That's ridiculous," Langford muttered. Daniel ignored the comment. Instead, he crouched beside the dock boards and pressed his hand against the wood. Another faint vibration moved through the structure. The repair he made had bought them time, not stability. He stood again. "This section is still under load," he said calmly. Langford frowned. "You already fixed it?" "No," Daniel replied quietly. "I prevented a collapse. The difference was enormous." Ruiz turned to the Marines beside him. "Clear the rest of the dock," he ordered. 2 Marines moved immediately, guiding the last lingering investors away from the unstable pier. Langford frowned. "You're acting like he's still in charge." Ruiz didn't even look at him. "Sir, if Captain Mercer says something isn't safe, I promise you it isn't." Langford folded his arms stubbornly. This marina was built by the best engineers money could hire. Daniel glanced at him briefly. "They designed the original structure," Langford scoffed. "And?" The expansion changed the load balance. Langford opened his mouth, then closed it again. Because the diver had already turned back toward the water. Daniel slipped his gloves back on. "What are you doing now?" Ruiz asked. "Stabilizing the anchor beam before the next cable goes." Ruiz's expression darkened. "There's another one about to snap?" Daniel nodded once. Probably minutes. Langford stared at the dock. "You're saying this entire marina could collapse?" Daniel didn't dramatize the answer. If the second beam fails, half the pier drops. The investors who overheard that went pale. Langford's voice rose defensively. That's impossible. Daniel simply pointed toward the water. The surface near the pylons had begun churning again. Even the untrained eye could see the movement now. The structure was shifting slowly. Langford rubbed his temples. This is a nightmare. Ruiz glanced at him. No, the Marine said quietly. A nightmare would be if he wasn't here. Daniel pulled his diving mask over his face again. He checked the cutter. Adjusted the air tank. Every movement was calm and precise, like someone preparing for something far more dangerous than a marina repair. Harper stood near the rope barrier, watching proudly. Ruiz noticed her again. "You okay, kid?" She nodded. "He does this stuff all the time." Ruiz smiled faintly. "Yeah," he said. "That sounds about right." Daniel stepped toward the edge of the dock again. Langford suddenly spoke. "Wait." The diver paused. Langford hesitated, clearly struggling with the words. "You saved my son." Daniel gave a small nod. Langford looked uncomfortable. "Thank you." The diver's answer came simply. He needed help. That was all. No pride, no lecture, just fact. Daniel adjusted his mask and stepped onto the ladder again. The water rippled below him. Before he descended, he glanced toward Ruiz. "Keep everyone back." The Marine nodded. "You got it, sir." The diver slipped beneath the surface once more. The marina grew quiet again. Langford stared at the water where he disappeared. The same water he had ordered that man to stay under. Now it was the only place keeping his marina from collapsing. Ruiz folded his arms beside him. "You pushed the wrong man tonight," the Marine said calmly. Langford didn't answer. Because beneath the dock, the second cable had just started to fray, and the diver was already racing toward it. By the way, if you're still with this story, subscribe so you don't miss what happens next, because the moment coming under that dock will reveal exactly why those Marines stood up the second they saw him. Beneath the surface, the marina looked like a collapsing skeleton. Daniel Mercer swam hard toward the central beam, where the second support cable vibrated under enormous strain. The broken bracket from the earlier failure had shifted the entire load of the dock onto a single anchor point. That anchor was seconds from giving out. The water around the pylons churned violently as the yachts above tugged against their mooring lines. Every movement sent tremors through the steel cables. Daniel reached the beam and gripped the vibrating cable with both hands. The tension hummed through the metal like a live wire. He didn't panic. His mind ran through calculations automatically. Weight distribution, stress load, structural pivot points, the same kind of calculations he used to run while standing beneath damaged bridges in war zones. Above the waterline, the marina had grown strangely quiet. Victor Langford stood beside Staff Sergeant Marco Ruiz, staring at the dark water where the diver had disappeared again. "You said he was a captain," Langford muttered. Ruiz nodded once. "Combat engineer officer." Langford shook his head. "And now he fixes docks for a living?" Ruiz didn't respond immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the surface. "Some people come home from war and want quieter battles," Langford scoffed. "Fixing marina cables isn't exactly heroic." Ruiz finally looked at him. "You should have seen him under a bridge in Kandahar." Langford frowned. "What happened?" Ruiz's voice lowered slightly. "Our convoy got trapped after an explosion took out the support beams. Bridge was about to collapse with 30 Marines still on it," Langford swallowed. "And?" "He went under it." Langford blinked. "Under it?" 3 times, Ruiz said calmly, while the river was rising and the enemy was still shooting at us. Langford stared at the water again. "And he fixed it?" Ruiz nodded slowly. "He held the bridge together long enough for everyone to get across. The developer exhaled quietly. That's insane. Ruiz gave a faint smile. Yeah, that's Captain Mercer. Below the surface, Daniel slid his tool from the belt clipped at his waist. The cable had begun unraveling faster now. Thin strands snapped with sharp metallic pings that echoed through the water. He needed to redirect the load. Fast. Daniel swam to the anchor bracket and examined the twisted metal plate. One bolt remained intact. Barely. If he could reinforce the bracket temporarily, the remaining cables might hold until real repairs arrived. He reached for the emergency clamp attached to his diving harness. It was a simple steel brace used by marina divers, normally meant for minor maintenance. Tonight, it would have to hold an entire dock. Daniel wedged the clamp into position along the cracked bracket. The metal groaned as the structure shifted again. Above the water, Ruiz suddenly stiffened. "You feel that?" Langford asked nervously. The Marine nodded. Yeah. The dock creaked loudly as the stress transferred across the beams. Several investors stepped farther away. Harper gripped the rope barrier tighter. "Dad's fixing it," she whispered to herself. Ruiz glanced at her. "You sure about that?" She nodded confidently. He always does. Back under the dock, Daniel tightened the clamp with deliberate turns of the wrench. Each twist forced the cracked bracket back into alignment. The cable tension began redistributing across the structure. But the metal fought every movement. One wrong adjustment could snap the entire beam. Daniel paused. He listened to the vibrations traveling through the water. The structure was still shifting. But slower now, he tightened the clamp another turn. The cable shuddered violently, then steadied. Above the dock, the grinding noise faded. Langford blinked. What just happened? Ruiz looked down at the water. He stabilized it. Langford stared in disbelief. With what? Ruiz shrugged slightly. Probably a clamp and pure stubbornness. The water surface rippled suddenly. Daniel emerged beside the ladder again, pulling off his mask. Ruiz stepped forward immediately. "You good, sir?" Daniel nodded once. "Temporary fix." Langford leaned closer. "You mean it's over?" Daniel climbed onto the dock slowly. Water streamed from his jacket as he removed his gloves. "It's stable for now." Langford exhaled loudly with relief. Thank God. But Daniel didn't relax. His eyes moved across the marina, the expansion wing, the heavy yachts, the strain points along the pylons. Ruiz noticed the expression immediately. "What's wrong?" Daniel looked back at the water. "The dock isn't the real problem," Langford frowned. "What do you mean?" Daniel pointed toward the far end of the marina, where the newest section of pier extended into deeper water. "That expansion is pulling the entire structure sideways." Langford's stomach dropped. "You're telling me the whole marina could still collapse?" Daniel nodded quietly. "If the anchor system fails," Langford's voice rose again. "So fix that too." Daniel looked at him steadily. "It's not a quick repair." Langford gestured toward the dock. "You just saved half the marina in 10 minutes. Daniel shook his head slowly. "That was damage control." Ruiz crossed his arms. "So what happens if the anchors fail?" Daniel answered calmly. "Every dock connected to this section goes down." Langford looked across the marina. Rows of luxury yachts, millions of dollars floating on unstable water, and investors watching everything unfold. His voice dropped. "You're saying my entire harbor is one bad cable away from sinking?" Daniel glanced back toward the ladder. "Yes." The developer stared at him. "And you're the only one here who knows how to stop it." Daniel didn't respond right away. Instead, he slipped his diving mask back into place. Because beneath the marina, the real problem had just started moving. The marina had never been this quiet. Even the wind seemed to pause over the water. Daniel stood beside the ladder, rolling his shoulders slowly as he checked the pressure gauge on his tank. The temporary clamp beneath the dock had bought them time, but not much. He could still feel the structure shifting beneath his boots. Small tremors, warning tremors. Victor Langford paced near the reception platform, running both hands through his hair. The polished confidence that had filled his voice earlier was gone now. What exactly needs to be done? He demanded. Daniel didn't look up immediately. He adjusted the straps on his tank, testing the weight distribution. The expansion anchors are pulling the main pylon sideways, he said calmly. If they keep drifting, the entire marina frame will twist. Langford frowned. So tighten them. Ruiz gave a small, humorless laugh. It's not a loose bolt, sir. Daniel finally looked up. The anchors are buried 40 feet down, he explained. Each one weighs nearly 2 tons. Langford stared at him. And they're failing? They're shifting. Langford's stomach tightened. And if they break loose? Daniel answered simply. The docks collapse inward. Ruiz glanced out across the water. That expansion wing stretched almost 100 yards into the harbor. If the anchors slipped, every connected pier would fold like a collapsing ladder. Several of the Marines had begun quietly helping marina staff secure the yachts. Heavy ropes creaked as boats were repositioned farther from the unstable section. The entire harbor now revolved around one diver. Harper stood near the rope barrier again, hugging her backpack. Ruiz crouched beside her. You holding up okay? She nodded. He's thinking. Ruiz smiled faintly. That's a good sign. Why? Because when he stops thinking, Ruiz said quietly, that's when things get scary. Daniel stepped closer to the edge of the dock. His eyes studied the water near the expansion pylons. The currents there had started swirling in strange patterns. Subtle, but unmistakable. The anchor chain beneath the mud had begun dragging. He turned back to Langford. Your expansion contractor didn't compensate for tidal shift. Langford blinked. What? Daniel pointed toward the deeper section of harbor. The tide pulls harder there. Over time, it drags the anchors sideways. Langford shook his head. That's impossible. The engineers approved everything. Daniel shrugged slightly. Then they approved the wrong math. Ruiz crossed his arms, watching the water. So how do we fix it? Daniel's eyes moved back toward the pylons again. We stop the drift. Langford leaned closer. And how exactly do you stop 2-ton anchors from drifting? Daniel reached down and picked up a thick coil of marine chain from the equipment crate. We reinforce the anchor lines. Langford blinked again. With what? Daniel lifted the chain slightly. This. Ruiz nodded slowly. You're going to lock the expansion anchors back into the main pylons. Daniel met his gaze. Exactly. Langford looked between them. You two are talking like this is normal. Ruiz chuckled softly. For him it probably is. Daniel clipped a heavy steel hook onto the end of the chain. Once the anchors are tied back into the frame, the stress redistributes. Langford frowned. And if it doesn't work? Daniel met his eyes calmly. Then the marina collapses anyway. The blunt honesty made several nearby investors shift nervously. Ruiz looked at the chain in Daniel's hands. That's a lot of weight to handle underwater, Daniel shrugged. Better than letting the dock fold, Ruiz stepped closer. Need help? Daniel shook his head. One diver's safer. Too many bodies down there increases the load. Ruiz nodded reluctantly. Fair point. Langford rubbed his temples again. This whole situation is insane. Daniel clipped the chain to his harness. Your marina wasn't built for the expansion. Langford snapped. It cost $60 million. Daniel answered calmly. And gravity doesn't care. Ruiz tried not to smile. The wind shifted across the harbor, pushing small waves against the pylons. The water near the expansion pier churned harder now. Even the investors could see it. Langford followed Daniel toward the ladder. "You're seriously going down there again?" Daniel nodded. "This time, I'm locking the anchors." Langford looked toward the restless water. "And if something shifts while you're down there?" Daniel paused briefly. Then he gave a quiet shrug. "Then I move faster." Harper walked closer, stopping beside her father. "Be careful," she said softly. Daniel knelt slightly so their eyes met. "Always am." She hugged him quickly before stepping back. Ruiz watched the moment with quiet respect. Langford noticed it too. For the first time that night, the marina owner looked almost ashamed. The man he had mocked earlier was now the only reason his son was alive, and the only person standing between his fortune and the ocean floor. Daniel pulled his diving mask over his face again. The chain clinked softly against the ladder as he stepped down. Ruiz leaned toward the edge. "You've got eyes on the surface, sir." Daniel gave a small thumbs up before disappearing beneath the water. The harbor swallowed him once more. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then Langford exhaled slowly. That man is either incredibly brave or completely insane. Ruiz folded his arms and stared into the dark water. "No," the Marine said quietly. "He's just the kind of leader who never leaves a problem behind." The harbor swallowed the diver in seconds. Dark water closed above him as Daniel kicked toward the deeper end of the marina, where the expansion pylons disappeared into the shifting mud. The heavy chain clipped to his harness dragged behind him like an anchor of its own. Each kick sent small vibrations through the water. He could already feel the drift. The anchors below the expansion wing were sliding slowly across the seabed, pulled by the uneven load of the marina above. Daniel reached the first anchor line and grabbed it. The thick chain connecting the pylon to the buried anchor trembled under enormous tension. He ran a gloved hand along it. The angle was wrong. The anchor had shifted nearly 5 feet from its original position. If it moved another few feet, the entire pier would twist inward. Above the waterline, the marina crowd had gathered along the safer platform. No one laughed now. No one talked about investments or yachts. Every eye watched the dark water. Victor Langford stood beside Staff Sergeant Marco Ruiz again, arms folded tightly across his chest. "You really think he can fix something like this alone?" Langford asked. Ruiz didn't look away from the water. "I've seen him stabilize bridges under artillery fire." Langford exhaled slowly. "That's not reassuring." Ruiz smiled faintly. "It should be." Harper stood beside them, staring at the water. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her backpack. "He's almost there," she said quietly. Langford looked down at her. "How do you know?" She shrugged. "He moves faster when something's really wrong." Ruiz chuckled softly. "That sounds about right." Below the surface, Daniel anchored the steel chain around the first drifting line. His hands moved quickly now. Years of combat engineering training guided every motion. He threaded the chain through the support bracket, locking it against the reinforced pylon above. Then he secured the hook with a heavy steel clasp. The moment it snapped shut, the drifting anchor jerked violently. The chain held. But the pressure transferred instantly to the second anchor line. Daniel felt the shift immediately. The marina frame creaked above him. Back on the dock, Ruiz stiffened. "You feel that?" Langford asked nervously. "Yeah," Ruiz muttered. The platform beneath their feet trembled again. Several investors stepped farther back. One of the yachts groaned as its mooring rope stretched tight. Langford looked toward the water. "Is that supposed to happen?" Ruiz didn't answer right away. He was watching the ripples forming near the expansion pylons. Then he spoke quietly. That means he locked the first anchor. Langford blinked. You can tell that just from the water? Ruiz nodded. Pressure transfer. The marina creaked again. Harper smiled faintly. He's fixing it. Langford rubbed his forehead. I still can't believe this is happening. Ruiz glanced at him. You should probably believe it. Langford stared out at the dark harbor. You know what's funny? He muttered. Ruiz raised an eyebrow. What? An hour ago I was yelling at him for standing on my dock. Ruiz chuckled. And now? Langford looked at the water. Now my entire harbor depends on him. Below the surface, Daniel kicked toward the second anchor line. This one had shifted even farther. The seabed around the anchor had begun tearing apart under the strain. Mud clouds filled the water. Visibility dropped to only a few feet. Daniel slowed his movements. Careful now. One wrong tug could send the entire anchor sliding free. He reached the second chain and wrapped the reinforcement line around the bracket. The steel links scraped against the pylon as he pulled them tight. His lungs burned slightly from the effort. But he kept working. Above the marina, Ruiz leaned closer to the water. How long can he stay down there? Langford asked. Long enough. That's not an answer. Ruiz shrugged. It's the only one that matters. The water suddenly churned harder near the expansion pier. Langford stepped back. What's that? Ruiz squinted at the ripples. He's pulling the second anchor into alignment. Langford stared. You mean he's physically moving it? Ruiz nodded. With leverage from the chain, Langford shook his head slowly. That's impossible. Ruiz smiled faintly. Most things are until Mercer tries them. Below the surface, Daniel braced his boots against the pylon and hauled the reinforcement chain tighter. The drifting anchor resisted. Then slowly, it shifted. The steel links locked against the frame. Pressure redistributed across the structure. The violent vibration in the pylons faded slightly. Daniel secured the final clasp. The reinforcement line snapped tight. For a moment, everything went still beneath the marina. Then the water calmed. Above the surface, the creaking stopped. The yachts settled gently against their moorings again. Ruiz exhaled slowly. He did it. Langford looked around in disbelief. The dock beneath their feet no longer trembled. The water had steadied. After a few seconds, bubbles rose beside the ladder. Daniel surfaced again and pulled off his mask. Langford stared at him. Is it stable? Daniel climbed onto the dock slowly, water streaming from his jacket. For now, Langford ran both hands over his face. I don't even know what to say. Daniel simply removed the chain from his harness. The job wasn't finished yet. And somewhere beneath the marina, one final weak point was still waiting. By the way, if this moment surprised you, subscribe so you don't miss the final turn in this story, because what happens next will change how everyone here sees that quiet diver forever. Water streamed from Daniel's jacket as he stepped fully onto the dock again. For the first time since the disaster began, the marina felt steady beneath everyone's feet. The yachts floated quietly against their moorings, and the terrifying grinding sounds from the pylons had faded into silence. But Daniel didn't relax. His eyes moved slowly across the harbor. He was listening again. Victor Langford watched him carefully now, no longer with irritation, but with uneasy respect. You said for now, Langford said. What does that mean? Daniel crouched beside the dockboards and pressed his palm against the wood. The vibration was faint now, but it was still there. 2 anchors are locked, he said calmly. But the expansion pier is still carrying too much load. Langford frowned. I thought you fixed that. I stabilized it. The same answer again. Temporary, never permanent. Ruiz leaned closer. So what's the remaining problem? Daniel stood and pointed toward the farthest section of the marina. The newest pier. the one extending furthest into deep water. That section is still pulling the frame outward, he explained. Langford followed his gaze. That's where most of the yachts are docked, Daniel nodded. Too much weight, Langford turned back quickly. You're saying we have to move them? Daniel answered simply. Yes, Langford blinked. Those boats belong to investors. Ruiz raised an eyebrow. And? Langford hesitated. They're worth millions. Daniel's voice stayed calm. And if the pier fails, they'll sink. The words settled heavily over the dock. Several investors nearby had heard everything. One of them stepped forward nervously. You're saying our boats aren't safe? Daniel met his gaze. Not where they are. Langford groaned under his breath. This night just keeps getting better. Ruiz folded his arms. Well, at least we know the solution. Langford rubbed his temples. Move the yachts, Daniel nodded. Now, Langford looked around the marina. Crew members were already standing near several vessels, waiting for instructions. He hesitated. For years he had controlled every decision made on this harbor. Now the entire operation depended on a man he had insulted an hour earlier. Langford exhaled slowly. All right, he said. Move them. Ruiz turned immediately. You heard him. The Marine called out. Marina workers rushed toward the boats. Engines roared to life as captains scrambled to reposition their vessels. Daniel watched carefully. The weight distribution across the marina began changing with each departing yacht. Slowly, gradually. But the structure still creaked under pressure. Ruiz noticed Daniel's expression. That not enough? Daniel shook his head slightly. The final anchor still hasn't reset. Langford looked confused. I thought you secured them. 2 of them. Langford's stomach tightened again. There's a third? Daniel nodded toward the deepest end of the harbor. That one's buried under the expansion platform. Langford stared. You're telling me there's still another weak point? Yes. Langford laughed nervously. This place is turning into a disaster movie. Ruiz smirked faintly. Welcome to structural engineering. Daniel grabbed another coil of reinforcement chain from the equipment crate. The metal links clattered against the dock. Langford looked at the chain, then at the water. You're going back down there? Daniel clipped the chain to his harness. Yes. Langford stared at him. You've already been down there 3 times. Daniel shrugged. It's not fixed yet. Ruiz stepped closer. You sure you've got enough air? Daniel checked the pressure gauge quickly. Enough for one more dive. Langford shook his head slowly. I can't believe this. He looked out across the harbor. The yachts were slowly pulling away from the unstable pier now. Crew members shouted instructions across the water. Emergency lights reflected off the waves, all of it, balanced on the work of one diver. Langford turned back toward Daniel. I owe you an apology. Daniel paused briefly. For earlier, the diver didn't respond right away. He simply adjusted the straps on his tank. Langford continued. I judged you. Daniel met his eyes calmly. That happens. Langford looked almost embarrassed. I didn't know who you were. Daniel shook his head slightly. That didn't matter. Ruiz smiled faintly. The captain hadn't changed at all. He never cared about recognition, only the work. Daniel stepped toward the ladder again. The chain dragged softly behind him. Harper walked closer. You going down again? She asked quietly. Daniel knelt beside her. One more time, she hugged him quickly. Okay. Ruiz leaned over the railing as Daniel placed his mask on again. You've got the surface covered, sir. Daniel gave a small nod. Then he stepped onto the ladder. The cold harbor water rippled beneath him. Langford watched silently as the diver descended once more into the darkness below the marina. The final anchor waited somewhere beneath the expansion pier. And if it failed before Daniel reached it, everything he had just saved could collapse all over again. The harbor swallowed him again. Daniel kicked downwards through the dark water, the heavy reinforcement chain dragging behind him like a metallic shadow. The deeper section of the marina was colder, murkier, the light from above fading into a dim green haze. Somewhere beneath the expansion pier, the final anchor was slipping. He could feel it. The current was stronger here, swirling in slow, violent circles around the pylons. Mud clouds rolled across the seabed where the anchor had already begun tearing loose from its original position. Daniel reached the pylon and followed the chain downward. There. The anchor line had twisted sharply against the base of the support beam. The massive steel anchor itself had shifted sideways, half buried in churned mud. One more hard pull from the weight of the marina above, and the entire anchor would slide free. Daniel wrapped one arm around the pylon and examined the situation quickly. If that anchor broke loose, the entire expansion pier would pivot inward. Every dock attached to it would collapse like falling dominoes. Above the surface, the marina had grown eerily quiet again. Victor Langford stood beside Ruiz, staring at the dark water with tight anxiety. "How long has he been down there?" Langford asked. Ruiz glanced at his watch. "About 2 minutes." Langford rubbed the back of his neck nervously. "That doesn't feel very reassuring." Ruiz kept watching the water. "You get used to it." Langford scoffed softly. "I doubt that." Nearby, the final yachts were finishing their repositioning. Engines hummed as captains eased their vessels away from the unstable expansion pier. The weight on the marina had begun to shift again. Ruiz noticed the water near the pylons ripple strangely. "Something's happening," he muttered. Langford leaned closer. "Good or bad?" "Depends how the captain handles it." Below the waterline, Daniel looped the reinforcement chain around the anchor shaft. The metal scraped loudly against the seabed as he tightened the line. Mud exploded upward, turning the water almost black. He braced his boots against the pylon and pulled hard. The anchor resisted. 2 tons of steel buried in shifting seabed did not move easily. But Daniel wasn't trying to pull it free. He was trying to lock it in place. He secured the first clasp and tightened the chain again. The steel link snapped taut against the pylon. The anchor jerked violently. Above the water, the marina suddenly trembled. Langford grabbed the railing. What was that? Ruiz's eyes widened slightly. "He's shifting the anchor." Langford stared. "Underwater?" Ruiz nodded. Using the pylon as leverage, Langford shook his head in disbelief. "That's insane." The dock groaned loudly as pressure redistributed through the marina frame. Several investors stepped back again. Harper squeezed her hands together nervously. "Come on, Dad." Back under the pier, Daniel tightened the final clasp. The anchor shifted again. Mud clouds exploded outward across the seabed. The steel chain screamed under tension. Then suddenly, locked. The anchor snapped firmly against the reinforced line. The entire marina frame shuddered once more. Then it stopped moving. Above the water, the violent creaking faded. The dock steadied. The swirling current around the pylons slowly calmed. Ruiz exhaled deeply. "That's it." Langford blinked. "You mean he fixed it?" Ruiz nodded slowly. "He just reset the entire anchor system." Langford stared at the water in stunned silence. That's unbelievable." Several long seconds passed. Then a stream of bubbles rose beside the ladder. Daniel surfaced again, pulling off his mask as he grabbed the railing. Ruiz leaned forward immediately. "You all right, sir?" Daniel nodded once, breathing hard. "It's locked." Langford stepped closer. "The marina?" Daniel climbed onto the dock slowly. "Stable." Langford looked across the harbor. The water was calm now. The docks no longer creaked. The yachts floated peacefully under the marina lights. His shoulders sagged with relief. "You just saved $60 million, he said quietly. Daniel wiped water from his face. "I saved the people standing on it." Ruiz smiled. That sounded exactly like the captain he remembered. Langford looked around at the investors and staff gathered nearby. Every one of them was staring at the quiet diver, the same man who had been mocked an hour earlier. Langford stepped forward slowly. His voice carried across the marina. "Everyone, listen up." The crowd turned. Langford gestured toward Daniel. "This man just saved my marina, and my son." Murmurs rippled through the gathering. Langford took a breath. "And earlier tonight I treated him like he didn't belong here." The admission hung heavily in the air. Daniel didn't react. He simply removed his gloves and set them beside the equipment crate. Langford looked directly at him. "Captain Mercer." The words felt strange coming from him now. I was wrong. The marina fell silent again. But this time, the silence carried something different. Respect. The word respect hung quietly over the marina. No one laughed anymore. The same investors who had watched Victor Langford mock the diver earlier now stood in complete silence, their attention fixed on the man standing beside the equipment crate. Daniel Mercer simply wrung seawater from his gloves. The apology didn't seem to change his posture. He wasn't standing taller. He wasn't basking in the moment. He looked exactly the same as he had before the crisis began. Victor Langford noticed that immediately. Most people would have seized this moment. Most people would have reminded everyone what they had just done. But the quiet diver just kept working. Langford cleared his throat. "I owe you more than an apology," he said. Daniel glanced up briefly. "You don't owe me anything." Langford shook his head. "That's not true." Ruiz watched the exchange with a faint smile. The captain had always been like this, never interested in praise, never interested in recognition. Langford stepped closer. "You saved my son," he continued, "and you saved this entire harbor." Daniel clipped the cutter back onto his belt. It needed fixing. Langford frowned slightly. "That's all you're going to say?" Daniel shrugged. "It's the job." Langford looked around the marina again. Workers had returned to securing the remaining equipment. Investors spoke quietly among themselves, many of them glancing toward Daniel with new respect. The atmosphere had completely changed. Langford exhaled slowly. "You know something?" he said. Daniel waited. "I spent the last 10 years building this place," Langford continued, gesturing toward the glowing marina lights. "Every dock, every building, every contract." Daniel nodded slightly. "And tonight," Langford said, "a man I treated like he didn't belong here saved all of it." Daniel looked at the water again. The harbor was calm now. Moonlight reflected across the surface like polished glass. Langford rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "I misjudged you." Daniel answered simply. "That happens." Ruiz chuckled quietly. Langford glanced at him. "You seem amused." Ruiz shrugged. "Sir, you wouldn't be the first person to underestimate Captain Mercer." Langford shook his head. "I feel like I should have seen it sooner." Ruiz raised an eyebrow. "Seen what?" Langford gestured toward the diver. "That someone like him doesn't just appear out of nowhere." Daniel leaned against the equipment crate, listening but not interrupting. Ruiz folded his arms. "Mercer's been like this since the day I met him." Langford glanced at him. "What do you mean?" Ruiz smiled faintly. "Quiet guy. Doesn't talk much. Looks like he's just doing his job." Langford nodded slowly. "That's exactly what I thought." Ruiz tilted his head toward Daniel. Then something goes wrong. Langford waited. "And suddenly, he's the calmest man in the room," Ruiz finished. Daniel gave a small shake of his head. You're exaggerating. Ruiz laughed. Sir, you once crawled under a burning convoy truck to cut a live detonator. Langford blinked. You're kidding. Daniel shrugged. Truck wasn't going to explode if someone handled it. Ruiz smirked. Yeah, that someone just happened to be you. Langford stared at the diver again. For the first time that night, he looked genuinely humbled. You know, Langford said slowly, I've spent my whole life believing success meant being the most powerful person in the room. Daniel didn't respond. Langford continued. But tonight, the most powerful person here was the one nobody noticed. Daniel glanced toward Harper standing nearby. The girl was watching the conversation quietly. Langford noticed her too. That's your daughter? Daniel nodded. Harper stepped closer, hugging her backpack. Langford crouched slightly to her level. You must be proud of your dad. She smiled immediately. I always am. Langford stood again. I can see why, he turned back toward Daniel. I don't expect forgiveness, Langford said, but I do want to make something right. Daniel tilted his head slightly. Langford gestured toward the marina. This harbor exists because people work here every day, divers, mechanics, crews. Daniel nodded once. Langford continued. And I forgot that. He extended his hand. Thank you, Captain Mercer. The dock lights reflected across the water as the two men faced each other. For a moment, Daniel simply looked at the offered hand. Then he took it. Not because the apology mattered, but because the work was finished, and the harbor was finally safe again. Behind them, Ruiz smiled quietly. Sometimes the loudest victory wasn't applause. Sometimes it was simply the moment when respect replaced arrogance. And tonight, everyone in that marina had learned exactly who the quiet diver really was. The marina slowly returned to life. Engines hummed softly as the last repositioned yachts settled into their new moorings. Workers checked cables and lights along the docks, moving with quieter respect now whenever they passed the man who had spent half the night beneath the water. Daniel Mercer sat on the edge of the pier, tightening the strap on his equipment crate. The adrenaline had faded. Now there was only the calm exhaustion that always followed a long dive. Harper walked over and sat beside him, swinging her feet above the water. You fixed it, she said. Daniel looked out across the harbor. For tonight, she smiled. That still fixing it, he gave a small nod. Across the dock, Victor Langford was speaking with marina staff and engineers who had finally arrived. Their voices were tense, hurried, but one thing had clearly changed. Every few minutes, Langford glanced back toward the diver. Not with irritation, with something closer to gratitude. Staff Sergeant Marco Ruiz approached the edge of the pier and leaned beside Daniel. Captain, Ruiz said quietly. Daniel groaned softly. Don't start that again. Ruiz chuckled. You know I'm not stopping. Harper looked between them. You two work together? Ruiz nodded. Your dad used to keep Marines alive in places a lot worse than this marina. Daniel shrugged. Same job, just different water. Ruiz smiled at that. A group of investors passed nearby, whispering quietly. Earlier that evening they had laughed when Langford mocked the maintenance diver. Now they looked at him like he was someone entirely different. Funny how fast perspective changed. Langford eventually walked toward the pier again. This time he didn't stand above Daniel. He stopped beside him. I've already called the structural engineers, Langford said. Daniel nodded. They'll need to reinforce the anchor system. Langford rubbed the back of his neck. They will. He hesitated for a moment before speaking again. You know, if you ever wanted a better job than cleaning docks. Daniel shook his head gently. I'm good. Langford raised an eyebrow. You're turning down a promotion without even hearing the offer? Daniel looked at Harper. I already have the job I want. The girl grinned. Ruiz laughed quietly. Langford stared at them for a moment, then smiled. Fair enough. For the first time that night, the marina owner looked genuinely relaxed. Sometimes respect didn't come from contracts or money, sometimes it came from watching someone do the impossible. The wind moved softly across the harbor. Water rippled gently against the pylons Daniel had spent hours repairing. Ruiz looked out over the calm marina. "You know something?" he said. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "This place will probably stand for decades now," Daniel shrugged. "As long as they stop expanding it," Langford chuckled quietly. Message received. Harper leaned against her father's arm. "You know what I liked best tonight?" Daniel looked down. "What?" "You didn't yell at the bully." Daniel smiled faintly. "No?" She shook her head. "You just saved everyone anyway." Ruiz nodded slowly. "That's usually how he wins." Because the truth was simple. The bully pushed the single dad too far. But the single dad didn't fight back with anger. He fought back with skill. With calm. With the quiet strength that comes from knowing exactly who you are. And when the Marines stood up for him, the entire marina finally saw the truth that had been hidden in plain sight all along. The quiet diver they mocked was the only reason the harbor and everyone standing on it was still afloat. If you've got another story title like this one, drop it below. Subscribe and don't miss our next story, The Waitress They Mocked at the Private Club, until the general walked in and saluted her. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?